All right, so today what we're going to be talking about is the Hughes Family Bank. And
Yes,
this was a concept that, you thought of many, many years ago. This is, it's been around, and I'm looking at the copyright. I'm on your website right now, the
mm,
James E. Hughes Jr. Foundation
yes,
website. Uh,
yes,
and for anybody that wants to go find it, it's jehjf.org. And so it's the James E. Hughes Jr. Foundation. This was copyright 1999. So the
mhm,
idea probably was formed prior to that. You
mhm.
probably were using it. So let's talk about, you have what is it, the idea behind the family bank?
Well, Michael, I have to tell the story because it's a very important story to who I am. Um, my father, whose name I have and who practiced law in New York City for 50 years, also was deeply interested in the question of flourishing families, a little bit more, perhaps from their enterprises than I have been interested more in the family, but very, very similar. He had a funny way of being because he was very cerebral man, good father, good emotion, but really cerebral, very, very smart man. And so he would have a funny way. I was the oldest of four children. I should say I am the oldest of four children. And so he would communicate to me in a Victorian way in which I was then to communicate to my brother and sisters. Obviously, we don't do that much anymore, but that was the way he operated. So one day, about 3 weeks after my younger sister graduated from college, let's see, she was born in 1950, so let's say the early 1980s, probably 1982. He called me one day, literally in a kind of Victorian way, and said, I'd like to talk to you, which meant going into his study, and he had a little study, something like this office, I guess, or yours. Um, and when he would make that invitation, I knew that I was going to leave with duties, but usually also with something useful to learn. So I went into his study and sat down, and he said, Now, Jay, he said, I want you to understand your mother and I are now a bank. What? Dad, what? You're a bank? You're a lawyer. What do you mean you're a bank? He said, Well, it's very simple. Now, Michael, when my father said it's very simple, that was at least an hour of great complexity. But I got used to it, and I was practicing law with him. I had a pretty good idea of how to think when he talked. So I said, Dad, what are you really trying to impart to me? He said, look, your mother and I had a plan when we got married in 1940, end of the Depression, both Depression era kids. I mean, that's a long family story too. And your mother and I made a plan. We've been planners and we made a plan, and that is that we would try to earn sufficient funds. She worked as a mom at home, the typical family at that time. He went to New York every day on the train, including Saturdays in those days. And he said, well, the plan was that we would try to reflate our families, but both had very difficult times in the Depression. And we would try to send all of you through private schooling. He believed profoundly in progressive education, as did my mother, who was an early childhood educator. My dad was actually the chairman of 3 or 4 different schools, 2 colleges. I mean, he was very committed to progressive liberal education. I said, well, yes, that's true. And he said, well, do you understand that the plan's completed? Again, Michael, what is he talking about? He said, well, your sister graduated from college. I said, now I'm beginning to hear him a little more clearly. I said, oh, I see. So Barbie graduated from college. He says, yes, so it's simple, He said, so we're now a bank. I said, Dad, what do you mean a bank? He said, well, what I mean is that your mother and I have completed our plan. We have some resources. And again, we were a professional family, not a business family. But my father and mother were incredible savers. They bought a savings bond, Michael, every week for 50 years. every week.
Wow.
So he said, essentially, we have more resources than your mother and I think we will probably need if we're being old people, because we don't want to be dependent on you. And he said, I don't really believe much in inheritances. I don't think they're much use. I prefer to use the money in my lifetime. So he said, here's what I'd like you to do. He said, I'd like you and your younger brother and your two younger sisters to form the board of a bank. We're not creating a company. We're not going to create an LLC. No, just of the bank. And from time to time, we would like you to ask each other's thoughts about a grant or a loan from the bank. I thought, well, this is very interesting. And he said, if you find there's something that one of the four branches would benefit from, then would you bring that to your mother and I? And he said, frankly, you're all pretty sound people. I can't imagine we would veto it, but we would like to know what you're doing. But he said almost always, and by the way, it was absolutely true. They never said no to anything in the right sense. So we commenced this family bank. And Michael, it's the most powerful idea I've ever encountered in our field, because my father and mother were saying the funds, not the money, but the spirit of the family now was inclusive of the six of us and our spouses, by the way. Was never any distinction in our family between those that were of a certain DNA and those who chose to join us. My mother and father always treated everybody who was foolish enough, as they used to say, to want to sit at our table. Well, maybe they'll make us better, was their attitude, which was frankly also a very advanced, I think, and appropriate attitude. So here we found ourselves, my brother and sisters and I, and the understanding was that if there was a need for a loan or a grant, we would prepare a business proposal and bring it to a meeting of the siblings. The purpose of the meeting of the siblings was not so much to say no, it was to benefit from what we might know about a similar issue. So we could have conversation and grow the social capital of our family, essentially, that internal capital that is us. So my father and mother were really saying, we are making a spiritual gift of our resources for the next rising generation, which is an amazing spiritual act. It's really not a physical act, it's a spiritual act. And that has stood our family in great stead, and many, many other families that I have suggested that idea to. It's natural. And there's something for my father and mother in it that my mother, who wasn't, I think, entirely certain about this idea. But if my father thought it was a good idea, she thought, well, all right, Jim probably knows it's probably okay. I'll go along with it. I'm not sure she was ever quite as keen. But for him, the release, so to speak, of a responsibility that he didn't feel. He was a patriarch in many ways, but he didn't feel responsible for those funds other than they're being invested properly and properly managed, and that there were enough for he and mom if they got to be old. So they were not see themselves as a burden on us. But what he was really saying is, look, you take over. It's appropriate now. I've completed my plan.